Welcome to day 53 of the Sociology Guide 2022 challenge. This week we're looking at methods in context. This will probably be the final video before the exam, which is on the 23rd of May. I nearly got there, so close. Just a little bit like Liverpool in the title. We just didn't make it at the final hurdle. So we're going to look at the methods in context question set for day 53. Day 54 and day 55 are on the website, and I will put all of the answers up eventually. We have missed the deadline a little bit by a couple of days, and of course I've got to go back and do some of the ones for the options too. So do please like, subscribe, and come back if you're still doing paper 2, paper 3. The question for today looked at setting and streaming and the strengths and limitations of using observations to investigate setting and streaming. The item here, sort of like lots of clues in it again. I'll go straight to that. So item A says setting and streaming is a commonly used internal policy that sifts and sorts pupils into ability groups based on their general ability, or more specifically, their ability in a certain subject. This can have both benefits and consequences for the education of pupils. So consequences of education for pupils is a big kind of hint here. Consequences for education of pupils might mean that it's quite a sensitive topic, that we're observing these behaviours that have a negative impact on pupils' behaviour and their potential achievement. Those placed into high sets and streams were more likely to display positive views of education. Now, if we're doing an observation and a group of students are very positive about education, are we seeing a true picture of all of the sets and streams? That might be something to consider. Whilst those in the lower sets may display disruptive and even violent behaviours based upon given low status, disruptive and violent behaviours, would gatekeepers want observers to actually go and see that type of thing? Might it bring up some ethical issues? May it have some issues for the teacher safety, for the researcher safety, for all the student safety? Bowler talks about sort of like sets and streams being like a psychological prison. So there are some ethical issues with investigating setting and streaming. The second paragraph, as always, talks about the method. Observations can be used to great effect in observing student behaviour, but they're not without the drawbacks. The presence of a researcher may alter the behaviour of those being observed. So we might think about the Hawthorne effect, we might think about impression management. The kids might change their behaviour. The teacher will certainly change their behaviour if they're being observed. Whether the research is overt or covert. Now, you may notice in the question, it just talks about observations. It doesn't talk about whether it's participant, non-participant, overt or covert. This is something that the exam board have started to do in this specification. It's just to talk about a method and allow students the ability to talk about the 2 different types or the 4 different types in the case of observations. Furthermore, observations are able to witness firsthand the impacts. So we might be able to get a really good insight into what is happening, might give us lots of qualitative data of setting and streaming. However, this may mean observing practices or behaviour that is ethically questionable, which kind of links back to sort of like displaying disruptive and violent behaviours. It may link back to sort of like the behaviours that teachers show if they are treating students negatively, that has an impact on their education. This could have consequences. These are lots of things that you could consider. Let's look at a few more. Well, of course, I talk about the who, the what, and the how. So who are we researching? Well, certainly we're going to be researching teachers, and we're certainly going to be observing pupils. Now, for observing teachers, they may employ methods of impression management. They're certainly going to be subject to the Hawthorne effect. They will change their behaviour when they know they're being observed. As a consequence of the topic area, setting and streaming, they may refuse to take part. They may not want to be observed, particularly if they have a disruptive class, for example, or they may be suspicious of outsiders in their classroom. And this could be the case even if you do a covert observation. You may need to gain the trust of teachers before they will allow you to observe their classroom. For pupils, well, we could talk about the different types of behaviours. Lower sets, we know, are sort of more likely to be working class boys, and they may be more disruptive, and this might be a reason why people don't want you to observe those type of classrooms. Higher sets being more cooperative, this could skew the research. If, for example, a gatekeeper decides that he only wants you to see the higher sets to see sort of like how setting and streaming works for the benefit of his good pupils, not necessarily how they struggle to cope with the lower sets. Because the topic is setting and streaming, we could potentially see disruptive behaviour, which brings us some ethical concerns. We may see bullying in the classroom, may see violent behaviours in the classroom, lots of different things. As a teacher who's taught bottom sets in the past, I can tell you that sort of like there is lots of disruptive behavior in bottom sets. Sensitive topic, well, particularly for those in the lower sets, they've been treated poorly. They've been labelled negatively. They've been labelled as low achievers. They may be suffering from status frustration. How might they feel if they're being observed by an outsider? Gatekeepers may avoid giving access to lower sets because it looks bad on the school. Interactions between pupils and teachers as well. Well, you can observe those. I mean, that's a key part of setting in stream is the interactions between pupils and teachers. Are teachers in the lower sets pushing their students to achieve as much as they can, or are they just giving them dumbed down knowledge, as Keddy says? Are they just keeping them cool? Are they just basically biding their time until they leave? And we link this into things like the A to C economy or educational triage. Observers can observe that, can observe those interactions, and that could be useful. The level of discipline that's in the classroom, and the researcher may start to develop an empathy with those in the lower sets, particularly if they are being treated negatively, and they may start to view these pupils as romanticize them in a similar way that Willis did with his research and looked at sort of like anti-school subcultures. Strength and limitations of observations. Well, gaining access is a big limitation. How do we gain access? We may have to establish a cover, which can be time consuming. If it's a covert obs as well, we may require additional training qualifications. Participant observations, well, people may lose objectivity, and we'll talk about this with relation to Stephen Bull's research into Beachside Comprehensive. However, you can observe first-hand interactions. They're really, really useful for seeing what is going on to get real insight into people's behaviours. But if people know you're being observed, whether you're overt or covert, the fact that you're a stranger in somebody's classroom, it could bring on the Hawthorne effect. And this is something else to consider. I'm going to walk you through sort of like how I've answered this question. And I would see this as being a decent answer. I would see it sort of like as being maybe touching close to top band, but I certainly wouldn't see it as being an excellent answer. My intro paragraph. Now, intro paragraphs, some people say do them, some people say don't do them. For me, the intro paragraph is almost to kind of get out all of the different variations of the method that you could use. Maybe talk about some of the bits like, oh, well, positivists prefer this method, it's high in reliability, it's high in validity, and then focus on the context specifically and the method and how that method is really useful. So in a way, the intro paragraph is setting the scene. So here I've put observations are a research method that can be conducted overtly with the knowledge of the participants or covertly without the participants knowing they're taking part in research. The researcher may also choose to take part in the activities of the group, participant observation, or distance themselves from the group, non-participant observation, to view their actions more objectively. They are commonly used in educational settings as they allow the researcher to see firsthand the activities of diverse groups. A lot of this is very basic information. It's very low level. It is just basically stated. I've not really developed it as to whether it's a strength or limitation. It's what I would see as being set in the scene. It's basically 2-3 lines there that sets the scene as to what I will discuss elsewhere. So I've done a 4-paragraph layout, as I've done in the past. I could potentially write 6 or 7 paragraphs, but I've tried to trim it down as much as I can to see what you would be able to do in maybe 30 minutes in under exam conditions. So I started here with one limitation of using observations to investigate setting and streaming is the Hawthorne effect. This is particularly the case with overt observations. So I've got my strength or limitation of the method there, the Hawthorne effect. It is a limitation as those being observed may change their behaviour, which has a negative impact on the validity of the research. Still focused on just the method, nothing mentioned here about setting and streaming. Now I start to layer it in. This may be the case with setting and streaming, as teachers may not treat pupils the same way as they ordinarily would do. Okay, so I've started to talk about the topic. Right, I've started to mention the people who I am observing. Not quite done enough for it to be a really good response, but now I'm going to develop that. For example, lower sets and streams are often given low levels of work to do, and if being observed by an outsider, the teacher may be more motivated to challenge these pupils to achieve higher to give a good impression of themselves. That now becomes a good response because I'm talking about the teacher and I'm also talking about the topic as well as the method. Now I'm going to just throw in a little bit of evaluation here. However, if conducted covertly, researchers may be able to reduce the Hawthorne effect and observe more natural behaviours. This is just focused on the method on its own. So the first part would be ticking all those three boxes, the who, the what, and the how. And the second part would probably just tick the method. Second paragraph, further limitation of using observations, investigating, setting, and streaming is that the researcher may lack objectivity in their research. We know that this is a strength or limitation of observations, that you can lose objectivity. This is particularly the case if the researcher conducts a covert participant observation. Okay, so we know we were still focused on the method here. What we're going to do is we're going to add in the context now. There is the possibility that the researcher may start to side with either the teachers or the pupils and subjectively interpret the behaviours that they observe. So they may start to side with the teachers or the pupils depending on what they see. You can lose objectivity in a participant observation, and this is an issue. So we've talked about who, we've talked about how we're going to do it. Now I'm going to throw in a piece of research that was specifically about setting and streaming. So in Ball's research into Beachside Comprehensive, he took part in the staff versus student cricket match and many trips and extracurricular activities. This may have impacted on his ability to maintain objectivity as he was clearly seen as a member of the staff. So I've developed that point by using a relevant example. I've not talked about streaming there, so this is probably a good response as opposed to a really good response, but let's see how I develop it further. However, this may also benefit the researchers being involved in the day-to-day activities, allow Ball to access to research many distinct aspects of the educational setting he was in, and would have provided highly valid data and an insight or verstehen into the lives those he was researching. So this is probably what I would see as being good. So my second paragraph's not as good as my first one, but I would still see this as being in the kind of band 4 type of response because I've talked about the who we are researching and how we are researching it. Paragraph 3, a strength of using observation to conduct research into setting and streaming is that the research can observe differences in behaviour between pupils in the lower and the higher sets. So we know there are differences between the behaviours of those in lower and higher sets. So I'm talking about the what, the topic here. This includes both peer and teacher interactions. We know that's part of setting and streaming and would enable the researcher to draw conclusions on the impact of setting and streaming on the behaviour of pupils. So we've talked about here observing differences. That's specific to the method, and we've talked about the topic, setting, and streaming. Develop this a little bit more. For example, they will be able to compare the behaviour of students who are placed in different sets for different subjects and draw conclusions based upon their behaviour in a middle set and a bottom set. So we've also mentioned the students, how they might behave differently in different sets. And then we can draw the conclusions from that. So this is moving up towards a band 5 response. Again, with each paragraph, I try to flip it. And so like if I've talked about a strength, I will talk about a limitation as well. However, this may be time consuming for the researcher, and teachers may be reluctant to allow the researcher into their classrooms, particularly if they knew the aims of the research. Okay, so this is probably a band 3/4 point. It can be time consuming for the researcher. Maybe could have developed that a little bit more. I could have talked about sort of like how it took Ball 3 years to conduct his research, particularly if they knew the aims of the research. Furthermore, pupils' reactions to an outsider in their classroom may differ, with lower sets more likely to act up, and teachers may not want to introduce such a distraction in their classroom. So I've now started talking about not only the who, but the what and the how. Probably what I would say has been a weak band 5 point. I could have developed that time consuming part a little bit more, but I've talked about teachers or pupils. I've talked about sort of the problems of setting and streaming, and I've mentioned a strength or limitation of using observations. Paragraph 4, final limitation of using observations in investigating, setting and streaming is gaining access. We know that this is a problem with covert participant observations and observations in general. It could be seen as being just educational research. Gatekeepers such as head teachers may be reluctant to allow researchers to conduct such an invasive method. Right, this is specific to observations. Observations are more invasive than something like a questionnaire, particularly with lower sets and streams, as it may reflect poorly on the school. Why might it reflect poorly on the school? If access is granted, head teachers may steer the researcher to higher performing sets and streams so that the researcher observes more desirable behaviours. We know that in setting and streaming, you're going to get more desirable behaviours in your top sets. We're talking about a person, we're talking about the gatekeeper steering the observation, and we've talked about how it's an invasive method and how this could be a limitation, and how the limitation then is access because it is invasive. So we're starting to move this to a band 5 response, and this would skew the representativeness of the researcher's sample, providing a more positive view of the process of setting and streaming than if all sets and streams were observed. That's a top bound point. What I've done there is I've really developed that point. We've talked about the method. We've said it's invasive. That's a limitation, and therefore it's less likely to gain access. So we've developed the point. We've talked about who might be involved in this process. We've talked about the gatekeepers and what they might do. And we've talked about why they might do it in terms of based on the topic area, the what. The higher performing sets and streams may be more likely to be observed than the lower sets and streams because it'll look good for the school. Again, flipping it round. However, researchers may adopt covert methods to access these groups without being steered by head teachers. So here's another point here. This, however, would be costly, having to obtain qualifications and undergoing background checks, whilst measuring the impacts of setting and streaming may take some time to complete. And the point I was going to make earlier on, for example, Ball worked in Beachside Comprehensive for 3 years before being able to draw conclusions on what he found. Now, I could have, the idea of measuring the impacts of setting and streaming is going to take some time. I could have developed that point a little bit better, but I would see this as being, quite a good point, probably close to a band 4. We've talked about the method, using covert methods, undergoing background checks. We've talked about strength or limitation, particularly of that method, that it might be costly, that people may have to undergo further training. And what we've done is we've talked about how setting and streaming can be time consuming to study. It could have been developed a little bit better, but I would see this as probably being around about a band 4 point. So, in conclusion, observations would be a good method for observing firsthand the interactions between pupils and their teachers in different sets and streams, and interpreting the impacts of these interactions on pupils' experiences of education. So I'm starting to sum up here. I'm not repeating too much of what I've already put, but I'm putting some general points in. However, much of the success of the research depends upon the ability of the researcher to both blend into the school, so develop a cover, blend into the school environment to minimize researcher effect, and their ability to remain objective through the research. Now, that is repeated from earlier on. If this is done successfully, then observations are an effective method of obtaining substantial amounts of qualitative data on the process of setting and streaming, something that will be favoured by interpretivists. So qualitative data, interpretivists, these are kind of band 3 points. I would see this as making a judgment on how effective observations are to investigate setting and streaming. We could have maybe mentioned setting and streaming a bit more, and we could have mentioned how it would help us to observe those. There's a little bit in there where we talk about the interactions between pupils and their teachers. So I'd see it as being a band 4, but overall I would look at this essay as being a strong kind of 15 or 16 out of 20. There's bits and pieces that we can improve on. We can always improve kind of on our essays. But I would imagine that if somebody looked at that and said, right, what else could this student have put in? And that's probably what would stop it getting to the top band with some of the things that we discussed. There are a few underdeveloped points in there. But if you hit those and you're hitting 15 and 16 on your methods in context, you're going to be coming out with a decent grade. Okay, that finishes the 2022 challenge, Methods in Context Day 53. I will post Day 54 and Day 55 just for posterity, even though you probably won't see them until after the exams, for future generations and also for my kids to see how sad their dad is. Thanks for watching. Thanks for taking part. From next week, I'll be looking at all of the optional modules, so I'll be going back over those. So please do kind of like and subscribe, and then you will get be notified of the videos as they come available. I'm going to try and do as many of the optional topics as I can to give you a really good chance of getting a good grade in these exams, because I think it's been a tough couple of years, 4 years, and I just want to do whatever I can to help. Thanks for watching.